Some wounds do not arrive like storms, they arrive quietly, in the spaces where warmth should have been, in the pause after a child reaches outward and finds no one fully there. Being unloved in childhood is rarely remembered as one single moment. More often, it becomes a climate, a way of breathing, a silent education in what to expect from closeness, from safety, from the self. And long after childhood ends, the body may still remember what the mind struggles to name. The hunger to be chosen, the fear of being too much, the habit of shrinking before anyone asks, the strange loneliness that appears even in loving rooms. Because when love is missing at the beginning, life is not only lived forward, it is also lived around an absence, a silence that shaped everything simply by staying. The first quiet absence. There are children who grow up surrounded by noise and still feel alone. The house may have been full. There may have been meals, schedules, birthdays, school uniforms folded neatly on a chair. From the outside, nothing looked broken. But inside the child, something remained unanswered. A need so basic it had no language yet. The need not only to be cared for, but to be felt. To be seen with softness. To be welcomed emotionally, not merely managed. This is the part many people miss when they think about childhood pain. They imagine cruelty, obvious neglect, anger that leaves a mark. But some of the deepest injuries are almost invisible. They happen when a child's sadness is treated as inconvenience, when fear is met with impatience, when joy is ignored, when affection appears only when the child is easy and successful, quiet, useful. A child does not know how to say something essential is missing. A child only adapts, so they stop asking, or they ask more. They become brilliant, helpful, funny, undemanding. They learn to read faces before speaking. They learn that love feels fragile, conditional, easily withdrawn, and because this learning happens so early, it does not feel like learning. It feels like reality. This is how emotional absence becomes identity. Later in life, people often remember their childhood with confusion. It wasn't that bad. Nothing dramatic happened. Other people had it worse. And yet, something in them aches with a grief they cannot justify. They feel guilty for the emptiness, as if pain must be earned through visible suffering. But the nervous system does not measure pain by appearances. It measures by safety, by attunement, by whether someone came close enough, often enough for the child to feel real in their presence. When that does not happen, the child begins to disappear in small ways, not physically, not socially, but inwardly. They become someone who lives beside their own feelings instead of inside them, someone who doubts their needs before they can even name them, someone who confuses emotional starvation with maturity. And because this absence was quiet, it often follows them quietly too, into friendships, into love, into the private space where they try to understand why they feel so lonely, even when no one has left. Where the hunger began. Every child enters the world with an unfinished nervous system and an open heart. They do not yet know who they are. They discover themselves through reflection, through faces turning toward them, through arms that soothe, through voices that soften after fear. Identity begins there, in the emotional mirrors provided by caregivers. A child learns, often without words, whether their existence is welcome. If love arrives consistently, the child begins to rest. They cry, and someone comes. They reach, and someone reaches back. They fail, and still remain held in affection. Slowly, the child learns one of the most important truths a human being can learn. I can be distressed and still be loved. I can be imperfect and still be safe. But when love is inconsistent, cold, distracted, or conditional, a different truth begins to take shape. Perhaps the caregiver was physically present but emotionally unreachable. Perhaps affection came only after achievement. Perhaps there was criticism instead of comfort, silence instead of curiosity, control instead of connection. Sometimes the parent was wounded too, overworked, depressed, frightened, emotionally immature. Sometimes they loved the child in the only way they knew how, and it still was not enough. This is what makes the subject so delicate. The wound is real, even when no one intended to wound. Children do not interpret absence with adult complexity. They cannot say, "My caregiver is limited by their own history." They say without words, "It must be me." That conclusion is not logical. It is protective. If the problem is the self, then perhaps the self can change and finally become worthy of love. So the child begins negotiating for belonging. They become pleasing, excellent, invisible, easy, hyper-aware. They sense moods before entering a room. They study people the way other children study games. They search for the safest version of themselves to offer the world. And beneath all of that adaptation is a simple longing to be received without performance. The tragedy is not only that love was missing, it is that the child had to build a self around the absence of it. Years later, the hunger remains, though it has changed form. It may look like falling too quickly for affection, or distrusting anyone who is kind, or feeling a deep ache when someone does not text back. The adult often believes these reactions belong only to the present moment, but many of them were written much earlier, when the heart first learned that love could vanish, harden, or never fully arrive. That is where the hunger began, not in weakness, not in drama, but in the earliest rooms where the soul waited to be met and was left listening for footsteps that never quite came. The mind learns survival. What happens to an unloved child does not stay only in memory. It enters the architecture of the body. Psychology has long understood that early relationships shape far more than emotion. They shape expectation. They influence the nervous system, attention, self-worth, and the way closeness is interpreted. A child does not simply feel sad when love is missing. The child organizes around the absence. This is the foundation of attachment. When caregivers are emotionally available and reliably responsive, secure attachment begins to form. The child learns that closeness is not dangerous, that needs can be expressed, that repair is possible after distress. But when care is inconsistent, rejecting, intrusive, or absent, the child's developing mind must find another strategy. Some children become anxious. They cling, monitor, seek reassurance, and remain deeply alert to signs of distance. Others become avoidant. They mute their needs, appear independent too early, and learn to expect little from anyone. Some swing between both states, longing for closeness while fearing it. These are not personality flaws. They are intelligent adaptations to emotional uncertainty. The brain, especially in childhood, is shaped by repetition. What happens often becomes what feels normal. If a child repeatedly experiences emotional dismissal, the stress response may become overactive. The body learns vigilance. It scans for rejection. It prepares for abandonment before anything has happened. In adulthood, this can feel like overthinking. People-pleasing, numbness, panic during conflict, or an inability to relax in love. Even memory itself can become fragmented around emotional neglect. Many people who are not deeply loved as children struggle to point to one defining event. That is because neglect often works through omission, not explosion. The wound is cumulative, built from moments that did not happen, comfort not given, tenderness not offered, emotional repair that never arrived, and yet the body keeps the record. A tone of voice can suddenly feel threatening. A delayed reply can awaken shame. A calm relationship can feel strangely unfamiliar, even boring, because chaos once signaled emotional importance. The nervous system prefers the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. This is why people sometimes repeat the very dynamics that once wounded them. Not because they want pain, but because the psyche is drawn toward unresolved patterns. It returns to old emotional landscapes, hoping for a different ending. The scientific language for this may sound clinical: attachment injury, developmental trauma, emotional neglect, dysregulation. But beneath every term is something profoundly human: a child trying to survive in an emotional environment that did not know how to hold them. And survival, when practiced long enough, begins to look like character. A guarded heart becomes independence. A frightened one becomes sensitivity. A child who had to disappear becomes an adult praised for needing nothing. But the mind did not choose these patterns freely. It learned them because once upon a time they helped love hurt less. Love feels dangerous. The child grows up. The wound grows quieter. But it does not disappear. Instead, it enters relationships wearing many disguises. Sometimes it looks like loving too much too soon, a desperate tenderness, an almost unbearable sensitivity to distance. The adult may feel devastated by small changes in tone, by pauses in affection, by the ordinary unpredictability of human closeness. What others call overreacting is often the old fear of emotional abandonment, still alive beneath the surface. Other times, it looks like the opposite. They withdraw when someone gets too close. They mistrust tenderness. They go numb during intimacy. They need connection deeply, but when it finally appears, something in them retreats. Because love, to a person who was not safely loved early on, does not always feel comforting. Sometimes it feels exposing, unstable, dangerous. It asks the nervous system to rest in a place where it once learned to brace. This is the hidden contradiction of childhood emotional deprivation. The longing for love becomes entangled with the fear of it. So the adult may begin relationships hoping to be chosen, yet unconsciously choose those who cannot truly stay. They may confuse inconsistency with chemistry. They may feel magnetized toward cold people, complicated people, withholding people, because part of the psyche still recognizes that landscape. It feels painful, yes, but it also feels known. There is often shame here, deep private shame, not just shame about being wounded, but shame about needing, shame about caring too much, shame about still wanting tenderness after years of pretending not to. Many people who are not loved well in childhood become experts at concealment. They hide their dependency needs behind competence, their loneliness behind humour, their heartbreak behind self-control. And yet the pain leaks through, in the need to be exceptional in order to feel worthy, in the inability to receive affection without suspicion, in the habit of apologising for emotions, in the way criticism lingers longer than praise, in the panic that says, if they see the full truth of me, they will leave. Perfectionism often lives here too, not as ambition, but as bargaining. If the self can become flawless enough, useful enough, calm enough, beautiful enough, then perhaps love will finally remain. The adult may not realize they are still negotiating with an ancient emotional equation. Maybe if nothing is wrong with me, no one will withhold their heart. But love cannot feel safe where worth always feels conditional. So the person stands in the middle of an invisible war. They ache to be known. They fear being known. They crave reassurance. They distrust reassurance. They want someone to stay. They expect them to leave. This is not inconsistency of character. It is the afterlife of an unmet childhood, the old wound speaking in adult language. The child still somewhere inside, watching every goodbye as if it might become permanent, the moment it is named. For a long time, the pain feels personal. It feels like being too sensitive, too needy, too distant, too complicated. The person may move through life believing their struggles are proof of something defective at the center of them. They judge their reactions without understanding their origins. They call themselves broken for bleeding where they were first cut. Then, sometimes quietly, a different awareness begins. It may come through a relationship, through grief, through therapy, through a sentence read at the right moment, through the sudden realization that the intensity of a present hurt feels older than the present itself. Something clicks, though not all at once. The story begins to rearrange. Maybe the problem was never that the child was hard to love. Maybe the tragedy was that the child adapted to an environment where love was too limited, too inconsistent, too unsafe to trust. This realization can be devastating, because naming the wound means also naming the loss. It means grieving not only what happened, but what never happened. The comfort that should have been ordinary. The affection that should not have needed to be earned. The freedom to be messy, afraid, tender, and still remain cherished. There is a very particular sorrow in realizing that the self one spent years criticizing was, in many ways, only surviving. And yet there is relief here too, a quiet, breathtaking relief. Because what has been named no longer floats shapelessly through the body. It begins to take form, and when pain takes form, it becomes possible to hold it with more honesty. The person may still ache. They may still repeat old patterns. But something crucial has changed. The shame begins to loosen. They start to see that their reactions were not random. Their fear had a history. Their vigilance had a reason. Their loneliness was not weakness, but memory. This is often the first turning point in healing, not transformation, not closure, just truth. Truth that arrives softly, but changes the emotional landscape forever. The adult begins, perhaps for the first time, to look back at the child with tenderness instead of judgment. to understand that what looked like overreaction was often terror. What looked like distance was protection. What looked like neediness was the hunger of someone who had not been fed emotionally at the beginning. And in that moment, the story becomes less cruel, not because the pain disappears, but because the self is no longer standing alone inside it, accused and confused. There is now context, compassion, language, a way of saying with quiet clarity, this hurt did not begin here. This pattern was learned. This loneliness has roots. Sometimes healing begins not when life changes, but when the meaning of the pain does. Holding what was unheld. Healing does not usually arrive as a revelation. It arrives as a relationship, a different relationship to memory, to emotion, to the self that once had to survive by becoming small, silent, vigilant, or perfect. For someone who was not loved well as a child, healing is rarely about erasing the wound. It is about no longer abandoning themselves in the same place they were once abandoned by others. This is gentle work. It begins in moments so small they are easy to dismiss. The pause before self-criticism. The ability to notice fear without becoming it. The experience of being cared for and not immediately distrusting it. The slow discovery that the nervous system can learn new endings, even if it learned old pain first. Psychologically, this is the process of repair. New relational experiences can soften inherited expectations. A safe friendship, a patient partner, a therapist who remains emotionally present. Even private acts of self-attunement can begin to alter the internal world. The brain remains changeable across the lifespan. The body, though shaped by early experience, is still capable of learning safety. But healing often includes grief. Because to become aware of the wound is also to feel the original ache more clearly. The person may mourn the childhood they cannot return to. They may feel anger where they once felt only numbness. They may discover how much of their personality was built around preventing rejection. This can be disorienting. If pain organized the self for many years, then softness may feel unfamiliar at first. Still, something deep begins to shift when a person stops asking, "What is wrong with me?" and starts listening for what their patterns have been trying to protect. The anxious heart may only be guarding against old disappearances. The avoidant heart may only be defending a place that was once left alone too often. The perfectionistic heart may still believe love must be earned through effort. Seen this way, even the most painful adaptations reveal a form of intelligence. They were not signs of failure, they were attempts at safety, and when that is understood, the self can be met differently, not fixed, not scolded, not forced into sudden change, met, with patience, with curiosity, with the kind of steady compassion that was once missing. Healing is not becoming untouched by the past, it is becoming less ruled by it. It is noticing the old hunger without letting it define every bond. It is allowing love to become less of a test and more of an experience. It is learning slowly that one can have needs without shame, feel pain without collapse, and receive care without immediately preparing for its disappearance. The child inside does not vanish, but they may begin at last to feel accompanied, and sometimes that is where the deepest repair begins. Not in forgetting what was missing, but in finally offering presence to the place where absence once lived. What love leaves behind childhood does not end when the years pass. It lingers in posture, in reflex, in longing. It lives in the way a person waits to be answered, in the way they apologize for taking up space, in the way they reach for love, or turn from it, or tremble inside it. To be loved as a child is to receive an invisible inheritance, a felt sense that the world can be survived, that emotions can be carried, that the self does not need to become extraordinary to deserve tenderness. When that inheritance is missing, the absence leaves its own legacy, not always visible, but enduring. And still, the story is not only about damage, because the unloved child often becomes someone of immense depth, someone who reads silence closely, someone who feels subtleties others overlook, someone who has spent a lifetime searching for what is real, what is safe, what is gentle. There is sorrow in that, but there is also humanity. The wound may never fully disappear. Certain losses do not ask to be solved, they ask to be understood, to be held in language, to be looked at without turning away. Perhaps that is what changes a life in the end. Not the fantasy of becoming untouched, not the promise that the ache will never return, but the quiet knowing that the pain made sense, that the child was never unworthy, that what was missing mattered, and that the heart, even after everything, remained capable of seeking warmth. There is something sacred in that. To have gone so long without being fully met and still to carry the instinct for love, to have been shaped by absence and still to recognize beauty in presence, to have learned fear early and still to keep some small room inside the soul open for tenderness. Maybe this is what remains after all the psychology, all the memory, all the naming. A simple truth. What happens to a child does not stay in childhood. Love leaves traces, so does the lack of it. And yet the human heart is strange. Fragile, yes. Marked, yes. But not incapable of meaning, not incapable of return. Even after years of silence, something inside it continues to listen for warmth, as if it has always known that love was supposed to feel like home,